Hi again. I'm going to be going into the lab to run a human dissection live stream class this October where, along with lots of other joints, one particular session is going to be dedicated to dissecting the sacroiliac joint, the SI joint. And I'll be looking at all the tissues and things that go over it, around it and through it. And it's a big project, I know, but one that I think is going to be really interesting for me because there's so much discussion, theory and ideas that I've heard over the years around assessment and, of course, treatment of the SI joint, the sacroiliac joint. There's reams of literature and books that are taken as pretty much gospel within the osteopathic and chiropractic field relating to the movement of the SI joints. There are assessments that look at how much it moves and techniques that are taught around treating it depending on how much movement is perceived in it. I hear, and you may have heard this a lot, people saying that their SI joint is out and that it needs to be put back in, presumably by means of high velocity or chiropractic thrusts or adjustments. I remember Tiger Woods back in 2018 sort of said his SI had gone out and credited a therapist with popping it back in. He literally said that. So where does this joint go when it goes out? I have no idea. Does it leave a message saying when it will be back? There's quite a lot of suggestions that displacements of the SI joint, it's going out, may be what's contributing to some back pain. And it drives this idea constantly. And it's been taken now, I think, as one of those unassailable truths that don't often get disputed because it's hard to definitively disagree. However, from my perspective, I find it hard to get my head around the idea of the range of movement that is claimed, at least from a sort of physiological standpoint. From the available literature around the SI joint, every SI joint I've seen in the lab as well, it doesn't really move to any degree that I think that would be palpable from the outside. When I dissect cadavers that are not embalmed, there are things that always move and things that just don't move. Now, you've got to bear in mind that there isn't any tension in a dead body. It can't stand up or hold itself in place. You can't put it on a chair because it will just fall off. So anything that's rigid is rigid because it's either pinned there through surgery or scarring or functional laydown, or because it's supposed to be rigid. The shoulders, for example, always have pretty much a full range of movement, but most of the spine doesn't move as much as you might think it does. It's pretty pinned. As for the SI joint, well, it just doesn't really move to any degree at all, or at least one that you could, I'd rather say that at least I could feel and measure. People say that that these are, elderly, deceased people, and yes, that's true. Most of the donors are elderly. But at the same time, death and the absence of tension increases the flexibility in these bodies, in these donors, to a degree that is, unimaginable in a living body. The stiffness in the SI joint is there because it's a joint that needs a lot of stability, to be fixed in terms of position of the body. There's a lot of nerves going through it. For example, the literature on the SI tells us that the normal range of movement for the joint is between 2 and 3 degrees of movement. So the maximum number of degrees that you can have, say as far as a circle is concerned, is 360, which isn't a useful measurement when it comes to joints. But in any event, 2 degrees is not a lot of movement when you compare it to 360. So by the time we get to 4 degrees of movement in the SI joint, we're looking at a hypermobile sacrum, and that's probably going to have a lot of accompanying pain and the whole of the body being, pretty unstable. And, with that degree of movement, 4 degrees plus, you probably wouldn't be walking very far. Now, there's going to be some degree of give when you sort of palpate something, but at 2 degrees in any range, it's not exactly clear how much you'd be able to feel of that movement you'd be able to feel underneath your hands. Now, covering the sacrum is a lot of stuff. If we look at the sacrum, there's a lot of connective tissue, fat, and deep fascia. If we look at this model here as well, you get the idea, and it covers the whole area. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible to feel 2 degrees of movement. I'm just, really clear and saying that I can't. So the number of fibers that travel in different directions through this area is just enormous. And if you palpated into the area from out here, which is what we're talking about, then you would feel some kind of movement deep into the tissues. But it doesn't necessarily mean to say that it's going to be the joint movement that you're feeling, and it doesn't feel likely to me. The joint itself, however, is really interesting. It's a synovial joint. That means it's got some degree of lubrication in there, synovial fluid. And this would suggest that it needs some degree of movement in this area. At the front, that's the synovial part. The posterior part of it, it's a lot more fibrous. So it's synovial joint at the front and fibrous at the back. In a dissection session, you need to work really hard to separate that SI joint and sacrum from the rest of the pelvis. And it's just not going to be one of those structures that you could get through with a scalpel and just separate, say, like the sternoclavicular joint across in the sort of from the clavicle to the manubrium. So even once you get down to that joint, you've taken away all that stuff that sort of sits over the top. There is really little movement in this joint, and it's more often a chisel that you need to separate that joint rather than a sharp blade. If you want to see this for yourself, then do come and join me on my live stream dissection class coming up in October this year, where you will see all the joints dissected, and you'll get to watch it and rewatch it forever. And it's a pretty silly price too. So click on the link above. Where's it going to be? It's going to be here, and find out more about that upcoming class. I guarantee it's going to change your life. The sacrum is under quite a lot of pressure, and it's what I would refer to as being a forced closed structure. So if I show you what I mean by if you take the palm of your hand and you take the heel of your hand and you push them really together firmly, really hold them together, then those bones of one hand are pushing together onto the bones of the other hand, and in much the same way that the relationship of the bones of the pelvis and the sacrum. Now, if I move these, they're in a slightly different position, but if I move these, I press the hands and I moved it sort of backwards and forwards, maybe a little bit of twisting in there, whilst maintaining that inward force, you'll feel some movement in there. You'll feel some forces on those sort of superficial areas, but there isn't really much in the way of any sliding or other movement in and through these compressed bits of the hand. And there's only so far it can go. It's not going to go very far. This kind of arrangement allows for movement and force to travel through this compression. If somebody jarred my elbow there, it would travel through it. So, and hence the synovial fluid. But the emphasis here is on the word through as far as the force is concerned. If you imagined jumping off a chair, landing on your feet on the floor, then a huge amount of force would need to be traveling through from your legs and distributed through the pelvis and into the lower back. None of the structures or tissues dealing with this force are going to be arranged in straight lines, because this force needs to be distributed through as wide an area as possible. It doesn't want to just get loaded into one place, because that's going to be very dangerous. If we look at the area, we can see a circular hole in the pelvis here, and that's going to help to absorb the pressure. There's a load that's in there, that there's different angles going in. There's no straight lines. The pelvis comes at an angle outwards, and the femur comes in. This goes at 150 degrees into the hip. So there's nothing that's straight. And the various angles allow for effective transmission and distribution of the force and the loading that is constantly taking place. Straight lines don't cut it. They don't load well at all. And if you had any right angle joints in the body, then you're just going to dislocate the moment you put any force or load through it. If you imagine that femur was straight there, it would just fall apart. So without the ability for us to be able to transfer forces, jumping off that chair would end up with the sacrum just shearing off and, pushing through, and would probably break the spine as well at some point. And that's what would happen. So I'm not convinced that pain in the lower back in this way is coming from joints very often. it doesn't seem to be something that would be happening to any regular degree as far as I'm concerned, in my opinion. From my perspective, the pain that people are experiencing in this area, and they blame on the sacrum, the SI joint, is far more likely to be coming from the huge muscle that's sitting either side of the sacrum and joining up, reaching across with its fibers and to join up in the middle. And then that, of course, is the gluteus maximus. And there are so many issues and acute back pain presentations that you could attribute to this big old fella back here. That is a whole other session for another day, probably a whole day. But I think it's rare that we can't find an issue whenever back pain is concerned with something going on the glute. So there we go, that's the SI joint. What do you think? Have you ever been told that your SI joint is out? Where did it go? What did it feel like? So please leave your comments in the chat box below, and please like and subscribe and do all those things you're supposed to do on social media. Come and join me on my joint dissection, and I will see you next time.